Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Sunday the 3rd of March. I'm Andrew Wilson and this is the Full Scottish. Today I'll have a short weekly update on coronavirus figures. Then I'll bring you the headlines from the situation that's continuing to evolve in Ukraine on day 39 of the illegal Russian invasion there. Then I'll introduce you to our two fantastic guests who I'm lucky enough who are joining me today, and then together we will discuss the main stories and the headlines from the past week together, reflecting on them and adding to the discussion because we have a little bit of time to do that today. So firstly, with regard to our weekly coronavirus updates, this status is at 2 p.m. on Friday the 1st. In the past week, there have been 60,415 new COVID-19 cases confirmed by either a lateral flow or PCR test. In the past week, there have been 182 new reported deaths, which are being reported within 28 days of a positive test for COVID. 4,355,289 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination. 4,093,341 people have received their second dose, and 3,452,587 have received a third dose or booster. 2,383 people were confirmed in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19, and 22 of whom were in intensive care. And since the start of the pandemic, a total of 11,469 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died. Now, with regard to the war that's continuing in Ukraine, this is an update on day 39 of the conflict. Ukrainian troops have retaken the entire Kyiv region, but they have discovered widespread evidence of what the Kyiv government says are war crimes committed by Russian forces. This includes bodies found in the streets, evidence of killings of civilians, mass graves, and murdered children. One woman, Halina Tovkach, says her husband was killed by Russians along with two children and their mother while they were trying to flee the fighting in Bucha. Also allegedly amongst the civilians killed by the Russians was Olha Sukhenko, the head of the village of Motsin, which is east of Kyiv, and her entire family. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and a number of other authorities have accused Russian troops of leaving behind mines and other explosives during their retreat from the Kyiv region. In Irpin, crews have found 643 explosive devices. Russia has specifically been accused by Ukraine's Attorney General of using children as human shields while regrouping its forces, as the first witness accounts from the newly liberated town of Bucha, which is northwest of Kyiv, emerge. Coaches of children were said to have been placed in front of tanks in the village of Novi Bikiv, close to the encircled city of Chernihiv, which is 100 miles north of Kyiv. Zelensky repeated his warning that Russian troops want to capture the Donbass and the south of Ukraine. In his nightly video address, the Ukraine president said, "We are aware that the enemy has reserves to increase pressure in the east," but complained that Western allies had not sent enough anti-missile systems. A series of explosions were heard and smoke was seen in Ukraine's southern port city of Odessa in the early hours of Sunday, witnesses have reported. Ukraine's peace negotiator reportedly said that Russia verbally accepts the Ukrainian position on peace talks, AFP has reported, except for the issue of Crimea. Moscow has also agreed that a referendum on the neutral status of Ukraine will be the only way out of this situation. Turkey is the likeliest venue for peace talks between Zelensky and Vladimir Putin, Interfax Ukraine has reported. A Red Cross convoy heading to Mariupol will try again to evacuate civilians from the besieged port, as Russian forces appear to be regrouping for new attacks in the southeast. A spokesperson for the Red Cross said, "Our team is on the move this morning from Zaporizhia to Mariupol and not able to give further information at this stage." Maxim Levin, a Ukrainian photographer, was also found dead near Kyiv. The Defence Ministry said Levin, whose work appeared in reports from the BBC and Reuters, had been shot twice by Russian soldiers. The Baltic states have halted all Russian oil imports and are encouraging the rest of the European Union to follow suit. UK military intelligence says that Russia has still not been able to destroy Ukraine's air force and air defences. This failure has seriously hampered their efforts to gain broad control of the air, which in turn has significantly affected their ability to support the advance of the ground forces on a number of fronts. And Pope Francis has come the closest he has yet to implicitly criticising Vladimir Putin over Russia's invasion of Ukraine by saying that a potentate was fomenting conflicts for nationalist interests. Now, as I say, we're joined today by two fantastic guests. Firstly, we're joined by Collette Stevenson, MSP. Collette has been the MSP for East Kilbride since the last Scottish election in May 2021, and before politics, she studied accountancy and worked in administration. Collette, good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon, Andrew. Yeah, I'm good, thanks.
Well, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us today on the Full Scottish. We're also joined by Simon Barrow, and Simon is a writer, commentator and director of the think tank Ekklesia, which looks at relationships between politics, ethics and beliefs. Simon, good afternoon. How are you keeping?
Good afternoon. I'm keeping very well, and there's sunshine on Leith.
I'm delighted to hear it. It's great. I'm very grateful to you for joining us today on the Full Scottish as well, Simon. One thing, Simon, coming out of the headlines from Ukraine, I was talking briefly, mentioning there the position that it appears that Pope Francis is implicitly taking. And of course, we know that this morning it's being reported that the former Archbishop of Canterbury has made calls for the Russian Orthodox Church to be expelled from the World Council of Churches as a result of the failure of that church to call for peace and to call for an end to the conflict. What's your just before we move to the rest of the stories, what's your reflection on that last piece in the headlines from Ukraine today?
Well, I think they're both very significant pieces of news. I mean, Pope Francis has actually said that he may make a visit to Kyiv, which could be a very significant intervention if he does. And of course, I wholly agree with Rowan Williams about the Orthodox Church in Russia and the World Council of Churches. The World Council of Churches Assembly is in August, September of this year, and I should be there. And the problem is that sections of the Russian Orthodox Church are fully lined up with the kind of aggressive nationalism that Putin has deployed, including the invasion. And he, in turn, is using them as cover, a kind of spiritual gloss on this kind of aggressive nationalism that he wishes to pursue. And from the point of view of the churches, this is what would be called a confessional issue, really, that when churches actually sink into supporting something that's basically evil, are the other churches going to act on this? This was a crisis that faced the churches in the 1930s with the German church when it became completely subject to Hitler. Now, this is, I'm not making that direct comparison, this is a different situation, but clearly action needs to be taken. Otherwise, the idea of ecumenism is simply the accommodation of whatever people do, no matter how wrong it is.
Thank you, Simon. I knew that we had the right person on the programme today to help us unpick that aspect of the developments that we're seeing, in particular with the role that churches, both nationalist and otherwise, and the role that church and state plays. So I'm very grateful to you for that. Thank you. We will look, first of all, this afternoon at the war crimes and the atrocities that are being reported from the situation in Ukraine. As the towns of Bucha and Irpin were retaken from withdrawing Russian forces, horrific photos and videos have begun to flow in. Ruined houses, burned down cars, and bodies of civilians scattered in the streets. Before the war, Irpin and Bucha were both quiet satellite towns of Kyiv, home to 60,000 and 28,000 people respectively. So, Collette, first of all, with regard to this story, it struck me last week, but it struck me again today that before this illegal war, these two towns of Irpin and Bucha were quiet satellite towns on the outskirts of a major city. You're the MSP for East Kilbride, and I love East Kilbride. I do love East Kilbride. However, it struck me that it is also, in many ways, a satellite town to the city of Glasgow. What what strikes either you or what has been striking your constituents with regard to the way in which satellite towns on the outskirts of large cities, and in this case Kyiv, those satellite towns have been treated by advancing and then withdrawing Russian forces, both in terms of the destruction of property, but also in terms of the apparent war crimes and the murdering of innocent civilians and children?
It's absolutely catastrophic, and like you say, Andrew, East Kilbride has a population of roughly the same as these towns, in the region of about 80,000. And I can't even begin to imagine something like that happening in East Kilbride, and neither would the residents of East Kilbride either. I mean, in terms of some of the photographs that I've seen this morning, and the bodies that were strewn about in streets that would be like the streets that you walk about in East Kilbride, it would just have an absolute devastating impact. And thank goodness for us having democracy here in Scotland, and never having to witness or evidence the likes of that. So it is really upsetting and heartbreaking. But I know that even from a local perspective, we have a multitude of residents come forward for their support to the refugees of Ukraine, and also trying to send over supplies and just kindness, humanitarian, medical supplies. Our Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government, have put forward funding in place to ensure that we are at the heart, showing them dignity and respect. So again, at a church level, we've had interfaith support here in East Kilbride to manage to get a busload of supplies over, and I believe it was Father Raphael who organised that. It's a Polish priest who's based in one of our churches here in St Bride. So that has been overwhelming. And again, the impact of seeing two young boys killed there, the likes of even my daughter, we've never witnessed anything like that. So it is absolutely horrifying to see those kind of sights, similar to what the size of towns that we have here in East Kilbride.
Of course. Thank you, Collette. Now, Simon, when we were speaking a moment ago, you were drawing a comparison, but also making a distinction between the circumstances in the 1930s and the circumstances we see now. We heard, as the invasion, as Mariupol was surrounded by the Russian forces, we heard the EU consul, who was the Greek consul, who was the last EU diplomat to leave the city, saying that he had seen things that nobody should see, and that we would be adding the name of Mariupol to a list of cities that was Coventry, Leningrad, Aleppo and Grozny. And now with the reports that we're seeing from Bucha over the last 24 hours, I'm wondering whether we're going to add Bucha to a list of cities and towns that might look something like Bihać, Kravica and of course Srebrenica. So I've asked this question of a couple of guests already this month, in the last few weeks. President Zelensky last year, standing in a playground of a primary school in front of a large hole that had been made by a Russian weapon that exploded at the primary school, he asked at that time, why have we forgotten the lessons of the 20th century? So you touched on that a little bit with regard to the church. Why do you think it is that we seem to be unable to learn to learn the lessons of the 20th century and learn what has to be done to prevent innocent civilians and children from being murdered by invading forces?
Yeah, well, I mean, the direct answer to that is that the lessons of the 20th century are very complex, and it's easy to jump to all kinds of hasty conclusions about that. I mean, we've already talked about religion. Religion is a much bigger factor in the Ukraine conflict than most commentators are actually aware of. It's a central factor, and we could come back and talk about that more. But in terms of where we are now, I think the context is really important. Putin is in deep trouble. Most of his forces that he sent in were conscripts or special forces, ill-equipped for the role that they were given. Only a few hours ago, a district of Kyiv was actually recaptured from Russian troops, and the conflict's moving east because of his continued failure. And I mean, this is where war crimes come in, because they've now been trying to use terror tactics, but they're not working in breaking the Ukrainian people's resolve. And there's no way that Putin can hold on to anything but a small portion of Ukraine. And as international pressure and sanctions grow, even that becomes problematic. In other words, the dictator is not going to win. There will have to be a diplomatic and political resolution of the situation. There'll have to be a demilitarized buffer zone, I think, in Europe, which we failed to achieve after the end of the Cold War. It's going to come back on the table, not as a concession, but as a security necessity. And in that context, pouring more weapons in, which is what some people are suggesting, will increase the death toll, which is already approaching 3,000 civilians, remember, but it won't actually change or improve the outcome, because that's set in a way. So our focus needs to be on international pressure, on solidarity. The Pope's visit might be an important role in that, humanitarian action, and above all, the resettlement of refugees, which are now approaching 5 million people, and which the UK government is disgustingly thwarting through a combination of incompetence, inaction, and underneath, I think, the pretense of concern, actual lack of will. And there's one last thing I want to add, which is that there are many untold stories of Ukraine right now. And one of them is the extent of successful and positive non-violent and civil resistance. People have been blocking tanks and military equipment with their bodies. They've been changing or removing road signs so that the Russian military don't know where they are. They've been offering money, food and amnesty to anyone who deserts from the Russian army. They've been using cyber interference. In fact, you know, the updated version of a book called The Politics of Nonviolent Action by Gene Sharp lists over 200 non-military tactics that people are able to use to resist occupation. And many of those are being used in Ukraine right now. And as I said, Pope Francis now talking about going to Kyiv, opening up another avenue for turning the spotlight on Putin, and for people out with Ukraine showing solidarity by putting their bodies on the line. Remember, calling for more weapons to be sent in is calling for other people's blood to be spilt. But really, what are we doing in all the terms that I've mentioned, but also in showing practical solidarity in this situation? So Putin isn't going to win, but the important thing is that we try to bring the war to an end as soon as possible and reach an alternative solution, and then look about containment. But please remember, lastly, that don't compare Putin with things that have happened in the 1930s. Actually, the real danger here is nuclear weapons, but actually Russia's economy is around the size of Spain, not much bigger than Mexico. It can be contained. And I think the growing opposition within Russia, which we've seen some manifestation of in spite of the censorship that's been in place, shows that from all angles, Putin is now facing a massive uphill struggle.
Thanks, Simon. And certainly I think everyone would agree that putting humanitarian concerns and security concerns, security in the widest sense, security for everybody, must be the two priorities that we see people focusing on in order to bring this conflict to a conclusion and to begin to rebuild in all senses. So thank you both for your thoughts and reflections on that story. What we should do now at this point, however, is move on. And that's because the SNP has demanded that the Chancellor returns to Parliament to set out an emergency budget as warnings mount over the scale of the Tory cost of living crisis, which is pushing households into poverty. The party's shadow Chancellor stated that families will be struggling to make ends meet following the steep energy price hike, as well as the rise in national insurance, and will face yet another blow when energy prices are set to rise this month and again in October. With the Governor of the Bank of England issuing a bleak assessment that the shock from energy prices this year will be larger than in any single year since the 1970s. Alison Thewlis MP added that while the Prime Minister and Chancellor may be able to afford to sit on their hands and do nothing until the autumn budget, ordinary people do not have the same luxury. And meanwhile, the TUC's General Secretary Francis O'Grady has said that millions of families have been pushed to the breaking point by spiralling bills and soaring inflation. So firstly, Collette, it struck me that the combination of universal credit being clawed back, the domestic energy charges, both consumption and fixed energy charges as well, which have jumped in Scotland, fuel, the cost of fuel for vehicles, inflation on all things beginning to increase significantly, the national insurance hike coming along, and the impact that we're seeing of a combination of those things on the price of food, bluntly. What are you seeing in your inbox, in your mailbag? What in terms of the cost of living crisis is which alarm bell is being sounded the loudest by your constituents and people who make contact with you?
I recently, on the basis of the announcement of the energy price hike and the energy basically security aspect, I actually held an energy surgery here in East Kilbride and I brought along British Gas and Citizens Advice to be able to at least give out some advice to some of the families who were struggling the most, and a lot of elderly people who didn't know where to go. So it was more of a signposting exercise in terms of what they could do. So, for instance, Home Energy Scotland obviously have been giving out the advice about put your meter readings in by the 31st of March. Before the 1st of April, when the energy price hike was due to go up. So that was warmly welcomed by a lot of residents as well, and obviously, sharing information like that on Facebook and on social media as well. But I have been inundated with people coming along and saying even they've went to visit their elderly relatives who haven't had their heating on, and the house is absolutely frozen. And no means of looking and being able to gain support. And I understand on the 31st of March, the actual websites for most of these energy firms actually crashed with folk trying to submit their meter readings as well. I mean, the SNP have we've made a calculation basically that most families, the average family, are going to be about £2,500 worse off, and that is really, really concerning, given that there's going to be a further price hike as well in October. So I think we'll still to see the worst to come, and despite the fact that I am getting contacted regularly. And the other thing as well I want to point out is East Kilbride is relatively high up here, right? So we have our own microclimate at times. So when it's cold elsewhere, it's even colder in East Kilbride. And yet the Warm Homes grant that the UK government give out link East Kilbride to Bishopton, the weather station. And the temperature there is usually a couple of degrees higher than what it is. So a lot older folk, a lot of folk vulnerable who are very much in need of that grant funding can't access it either. And I mean, the UK government were willing to give out, a £200 loan, and you had to pay it back, at 40 quid per year. Whilst we in the Scottish government decided to give it direct through the council tax. And Kate Forbes, the Finance Cabinet Secretary, clearly stated as well that it was the quickest and most effective way to get it into the pockets of the most vulnerable.
Thanks, Collette. I personally remember the microclimate in East Kilbride very well, and I'm not making light of it. As a matter of fact, for your constituents, especially those who are on lower incomes or are older, the impact of the lack of localisation undoubtedly will be significant upon them. We're still in the winter months here. You can't suggest it's going to be summer weather for quite some time. But let's move on to another UK politics story for a moment, and that is with regard to the news this week that fixed price penalty notices have begun to be issued by the police in Westminster in respect of the alleged parties which took place during lockdown. It appears this week that Firstly, is it crunch time for Downing Street, where the first 20 people have received fixed penalty notices for partying during lockdown? Now, some of these people will pay a £50 penalty, and for that money they could have bought a ticket to watch England play cricket, or 5 seconds of a private speech made by Theresa May. But it struck me certainly this week that we're now seeing tax-cutting Conservatives who in fact raise tax, and we've now got law and order Conservatives who by and large preside over breaking the law. And it struck me also this week that it seems that Boris Johnson seems to think that that he's going to get away with this. When he addressed the infamous dinner this week of the Conservative Parliamentary Party in a hotel in Westminster, he poked fun at those Tory MPs who were disgusted by Partygate and who tried to remove him. He said that they should be grateful that they did not live in Russia, where Vladimir Putin has nobody to write 54 letters to Sir Bradisky. He was especially mocking of Conservative MPs who wrote to demand a confidence vote. And then I'm reflecting that just a few weeks ago, it looked like Johnson was on the precipice of losing his premiership. However, after this dinner during the week, one senior Tory MP is quoted as saying that the number of jokes that Boris devoted to Partygate showed that he is either monumentally insensitive or monumentally self-confident, or both. So Simon, is on the evidence that we have now, both of the denials to Parliament that these events took place, the copious quantities of evidence that they did take place, Sue Gray's investigation, a Metropolitan Police investigation, the beginning of issuing of fixed penalty notices to people who are said to have attended these parties. On this evidence, is it the case that Johnson is monumentally insensitive or monumentally self-confident or maybe monumentally something else?
Well, I mean, what this whole situation illustrates is the sheer lack of democratic accountability in the Westminster system at the moment. I mean, this is a government that openly defies any attempt to hold them accountable in any sense. So, both the Prime Minister and ministers have lied and misled Parliament, but no action has been taken about it. The reason they're confident, I think, that there will be no ultimate sanction as far as Partygate is concerned is that there hasn't been so far, and Johnson will simply refuse to resign. And I think the Conservative Party, the opposition to him has just melted away. Their calculation is simply when is the best time to call an election. I suspect it will be towards the end of next year, and when to get rid of Johnson and try and appoint somebody who they think will be more popular with the public. They'll be watching the polls very carefully. This is all about political calculation. It's not about morals. It's not about ethics. It's not about anything, really. And in the meantime, in a kind of strange way, though many of us are absolutely outraged by it, as are many in the public, the evidence is that, Partygate is still being used basically to detract from other things. I mean, you mentioned in your introduction low tax advocating MPs who are actually raising taxes. But the previous thing that we were talking about, what we need is a windfall levy on energy companies. We need £1,000 into the hands of the poorest people straight away. We need to reverse the benefit cap. Remember that £20 a week lifted 400,000 children out of poverty. We need increases on taxes for the wealthiest and for large capital. We need, a government that's willing to move rapidly towards a mixture of jobs guarantee and universal basic income and services, and to restructure the whole economy on the basis of Green New Deal. None of that is making the headlines because, in a sense, on the one hand, they know they're going to probably get away with it. And on the other hand, this just detracts from other really big issues, including coronavirus. The virus has not gone away. We have a political class in Westminster who are kind of pretending that it doesn't exist anymore. And this is a long-term disaster because coronavirus is the start of a whole series of issues to do with pandemics, which we're going to have to tackle in the future. All of that is being swept aside at the moment, and it's absolutely disgraceful.
Thank you, Simon. Turning to you, Collette, Simon was talking there about the political calculation, in particular political calculation with regard to general elections. and political calculations with regard to the lifespan or the political lifespan of the current Prime Minister. There is, however, another political calculation, because we are only now a very few number of weeks away from local elections in Scotland, local elections in England, mayoral elections in England, and elections for the Stormont Assembly in Northern Ireland as well. So, Collette, in terms of how what is a national or a Westminster political story, which has spilled over a little into Scottish politics, in particular internal party politics within the Conservative Party, how do you think that Partygate, as we understand it at the moment, and as it's likely to unfold over the next few weeks, is that going to have an impact on local elections, both in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK?
I very much think so, Andrew, and I believe that it's not gone away, despite the Tories and Boris Johnson, trying to say, put a smoke screen up here, move on, nothing to see here, and the fact that he's laughing at us basically. But when you actually start tapping on the doors, people don't forget, particularly how emotive it was when folk weren't able to visit their loved ones, folk were dying. The actual the way in which he's dealt with it. He willfully misled Parliament and broke the ministerial codes. So it goes without saying that people won't forget it. And from a moral perspective, I feel that as a leader, and from a party perspective, that he's lost the authority to basically to lead as well. And I know that speaking to people in East Kilbride and beyond, that they haven't forgotten about it. And what's more galling as well is the fact that he thinks he's got away with it. And I hope that on the day, and I know that there's always a small turnout, so I'm always keen to make sure that people get out there and vote at the local elections, that that they don't forget, and that is quite apparent when we see the results coming through as well. It's a huge threat to our democracy, to allow that to continue on, and not be held accountable for his actions. And I mean, you see that the actual fines themselves of £50 for junior ministers, when there were students getting fined up to something like £10,000. I mean, I personally think, and along with most of my SNP colleagues, that he has to resign over this, and it's not going to go away. And I certainly won't allow it to go away anyway, given the strength of feeling that I had with some of the emails that came forward from my constituents, demanding why he was allowed to have a party. They hadn't seen their loved ones for well over a year. They weren't able to visit care homes or even go to the hospital to visit their relations who were seriously ill in hospital with COVID as well. I sincerely hope that our local government elections, and I actually was down at Cardiff visiting the Plaid Cymru conference quite recently to discuss first past the post versus STV, which is a completely different matter altogether. But I got a sense from talking there to some of the Plaid Cymru colleagues that they had the same sense of injustice that this wasn't going to go away. Again, I just hope that wrongdoing, it gets held to account at these elections.
Thank you, Collette. Certainly, in terms of the last story, we were talking about the cost of living crisis and the assertion that Rishi Sunak is washing his hands of that, and now the assertion that both Johnson and the Cabinet Office are attempting to wash their hands of their conduct during lockdown. I'm pretty confident that these are stories that will continue to mix together and that we will come back to as well. But Simon, for the moment, I was going over the weekend. Another player in the political history of Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, has been blogging over the weekend, and he's accused Boris Johnson of encouraging attacks on junior civil servants over the Partygate scandal in order to protect himself and his wife Carrie. or I should say his current wife, Carrie. The Prime Minister's one-time senior aide has said that senior officials have turned a blind eye to his behaviour, and Cummings has referred to briefings against one Number 10 Private Secretary, Hannah Young. It has emerged that her leaving a party on the 18th of June led to the first fines that were announced this week. A total of 20 fixed penalty notices have been issued to staff who broke lockdown rules, and Johnson, of course, had previously told Parliament that when the allegations first came to light, that all guidance was followed in Number 10. However, in his latest blog with an excerpt that's on Twitter, Mr Cummings has said it is deeply, deeply contemptible that not just the Prime Minister but senior civil servants have allowed such people to have such people as Young to have their reputations attacked in order to protect the sociopathic narcissist currently squatting in the Number 10 flat. So, in terms of the ethical angle of this and the allegation that for political purposes operatives are attempting to focus on junior civil servants who have a considerable reputation in the cabinet in Downing Street in the cabinet office, according to Cummings. What's your view on the ethical? What's your ethical take on this conduct by political leaders with regard to civil servants in the context of Partygate?
Well, first of all, isn't it an irony that Dominic Cummings has emerged as an ethical warrior? I don't think we would have predicted that from the past. Actually, it's important not to dismiss what he says. Yes, of course, he's out for revenge. Yes, of course, he's trying to cover his own rather disreputable actions in the past around Brexit and actually helping to put Boris into Downing Street in the first place. But that doesn't mean what he's saying now isn't absolutely right and well informed. So we should actually take notice of that. And ethics is really out the window on all of this. I mean, the broader context is, yes, there's an attempt to blame civil servants and junior people in the government. Also, of course, Johnson is at the moment continuing to use effectively executive orders to govern. He's bypassing Parliament on a whole range of issues. There are going to be attempts effectively to gerrymander future elections. It's only an unelected House of Lords which is effectively holding a majority in the Parliament that doesn't actually represent the whole of the UK, let alone Scotland, to account. I mean, this is the broader context of it. There's a real erosion of democracy going on here. It's about ethics and it's about the corruption of politics. And whilst I agree with Collette that people aren't going to forget or forgive, nevertheless, I think that the kind of manipulation that we're seeing at Westminster is going to continue. And I have no expectation that Johnson will go before it suits the Conservative Party for him to go. Certainly in Scotland, the Tories should and hopefully will pay a price for this kind of manipulation. But the overall system within the UK enables someone like this to come to power. And that's a really, really serious issue. So there are huge and wider ethical and political questions. And so while I think he's probably going to get away with this at a macro level, I think it will add up to a whole range of things that in the long run will not only hold this UK government to account, but the system that is effectively propping it up as well. And as I say, in Scotland, we have some different choices that we can make over all of that.
Absolutely, Simon. And just listening to you there, it crosses my mind you were describing the broader issues with the current political system in Westminster as being huge issues. And it crossed my mind that in terms of beginning to address huge issues, do you think that the electorate and the political classes in the UK have an appetite to break those huge issues down into digestible and dealable smaller ethical issues, or is the scale of the task? Do you feel the scale of the task is too enormous now?
Well, I think the job of politicians and others who really care about the future is to try to link the big issues to the doorstep issues in terms of, say, the local council elections, but the issues that are really confronting people in their daily lives, like the cost of living situation. That's where people start to respond and start to see the world differently and recognise what's being done is actually punishing them, whilst millionaires and big corporations get away with huge things. And while the question of who governs us, how we're governed, and how we actually hold our rulers to account comes into view. But I think that the larger issues are ones that people pick up from addressing the immediate ones that confront them. So it's very important, I think in the local elections, it's very important to focus on local government and the huge positive role that local government can play. But the fact that even in Scotland, I'm afraid, local government in terms of its finance and support is in an immensely difficult situation. It's always in the interest of central governments to kind of, push local government aside, but local government is where a lot of services and where things that impact people's lives happen. And we need a massive reform of local government finance. We need a move towards land value tax. We need councillors who are better paid, and so on. I'm afraid the Scottish Government isn't taking those issues nearly seriously enough, and I hope people will vote, in a way that actually puts the priority of local issues at the centre in terms of local government elections. Unfortunately, that often doesn't happen, but we need big change there too.
Big change there too. Thank you, Simon. I appreciate it. Let's move on now to our next story, which is that the Prime Minister is said to be determined to press on with plans to build nuclear power stations, despite the Chancellor's concerns over cost. Boris Johnson wants his promised energy security strategy to bet big on nuclear, despite Rishi Sunak's reservations. But Johnson has cooled on more onshore wind turbines in England amid a Conservative backlash in the Shires. The Prime Minister is determined to press ahead with plans to build up to 8 new nuclear power stations, even though the Chancellor has concerns about the cost, which is projected to reach more than £13 billion. And if that's a projection, you can expect it's going to cost a great deal more than that. It's understood that the energy strategy expected to be announced now next week is likely to contain targets for nuclear, but will not put a figure on cost. The Treasury is understood to have concerns about expanding nuclear power in the UK with the cost of new plants due to be loaded onto people's energy bills under our fresh funding system. The government would also like to take minority stakes in new projects and has set aside an estimated £1.7 billion on getting one plant, Sizewell C, in a position to go ahead. But with a renewed focus on weaning the UK off gas, Johnson is insistent on the need to press ahead with new plants, with a draft target of around 16 gigawatts of nuclear in the medium term and closer to 30 gigawatts in the longer term. According to the government's own impact assessment, it takes on average 13 to 17 years from initial investment, the electricity being generated by a new nuclear power plant. So, Collette, you were talking a moment ago about the experience and the challenges being faced by some of your constituents living in East Kilbride, which has a reputation for being somewhat chilly in the winter. And I'm not making light of it. By its geography and its meteorology, it can be a cold town to live in. Not in terms of the people, of course, heating in East Kilbride is an immediate concern, as Simon would describe it, and yet we're seeing the Prime Minister talking about policies which on the estimates from Whitehall would only begin to wean people off gas and oil in 13 to 17 years' time. So the two questions really: do you think that do you and your constituents, do they think that what little we know about Westminster's energy security policy is going to have any positive impact on people at all? And more generally, are you hearing anything from constituents or and elsewhere in terms of people's view about how we might consider changing the energy mix in Scotland in order to make it more secure and, more importantly, in order that we move to a net zero economy?
In terms of the feedback that I'm getting from constituents, I mean, at the heart of it is the cost to the consumer and the bills that they actually pay. So from in terms of building more nuclear power stations, I mean, as you know, as a party, we're completely opposed to it, and we would like to, move forward in terms of our targets for net zero. And renewables, as we know, are cheaper. So you only need to look at the likes of Hinckley Power Station and see the huge losses that's making and well over budget. So for them to want to build more of them would have an impact on the public purse. So constituents are obviously really, really worried at this moment in time. So to hear that from our Prime Minister is hugely concerning. When at the heart of it, we in Scotland have obviously, put down some really, good targets in terms of net zero, decarbonisation. We've got all those, energy supplies, whether it be wind, water as well. And I think, even looking at our housing stock here as well, is how we can actually make, that transition over as well. And I mean, looking at the sort of just transition as well, the impact as well from losing, the carbon capture up in the northeast as well. Again, it kind of flies in the face of Scotland and our residents as well, in terms of them being serious about meeting the net zero targets as well. So we are completely committed. And again, when you're talking to people on the doorsteps, when you're dealing with emails that are coming in about energy security, fuel poverty as well, nuclear power stations are certainly not the answer. And again, it is just going to hit us even worse. And I think there's worse to see as well, Andrew, going forward.
Of course, thank you, Collette. Simon, in terms of this, what we've learned so far with regard to the energy policy that is now finally expected to emerge from Westminster next week, it struck me personally that again this might be another reflection of what I would characterise probably a bit nastily as 1950s style thinking. My thoughts on that started seeing Johnson and Truss travelling around the Middle East, seeking to do deals in order to secure oil supplies over the last 2 weeks, and now we seem to have some kind of white heat of technology, never had it so good rush to build nuclear power stations once more, just as we begin to decommission the ones that were built the first time around. So, in do you think is it an indication of 1950s style thinking, or is it weak thinking, or narrow thinking, or just some other form of attitude or approach to addressing problems for people that we're seeing from Westminster with regard to energy policy?
Well, we know, and there's massive evidence, that nuclear power takes years to develop. It's vastly expensive. It requires massive public subsidies, and it's hugely dangerous in both the short term and certainly the long term. So you might say, so why are they looking at this as a solution? And the answer, of course, is follow the money. One of the things that's happening at the moment is that the fossil fuel companies are really worried that disinvestment is taking place, that we're obviously going to have to move to a green and renewable future, and they're going to lose money. So they're already trying to shift resources into the nuclear industry. And the attempt is to sort of say, nuclear is a solution because that means we can go on consuming just as much energy as we have. We can maintain our lifestyles based on massive consumption and so on. You won't have to make any sacrifices, and it'll all be absolutely fine. But the answer, of course, is that the reason they're doing this is that that's how a lot of people are going to make a lot of money out of a system that will fail if we go down that route. So I have no confidence in the strategy that's going to emerge from Westminster. It'll be smoke and mirrors. The question, of course, is what we do in Scotland, because the reality is that Scotland has around 35% of Europe's on and offshore renewable energy potential. We absolutely know where the future is. The question is, who's going to control the future? And one of the biggest arguments for independence has to be that we have to take those resources and move Scotland in a completely different, safer, economically prosperous and green direction. And we have to start that now. And I think, the issue in Scotland is not only the issue of independence and the relationship between those two things I've just pointed out, but also where our strategy starts here. The Scottish Government's doing a lot of good things, but it's not moving nearly fast enough on them. And, in terms of just transition, SNP as well as the Greens have passed policies calling for a roadmap, calling for a jobs register, calling for large-scale investment. We need to be clear about what can be achieved with the powers that Scotland already has and the powers that we absolutely desperately need to go the full length, if you like. And I think my last comment on this is that, I understand the point that Collette made about carbon capture in the northeast, and I understand why MSPs and MPs in that region would speak in favour of it, but it isn't the solution. It's actually a complete waste of money. We need huge investment in the northeast in terms of a transition. And also, we desperately need in Scotland a public energy company, not a retail company, a production company. The SNP conference has called for it twice. The Greens have called for it. The Scottish Government is in some difficulty in terms of finance, I do understand that, but we need a green industrial strategy, we need an energy strategy, we also need a port strategy in order to be able to move forward with the powers that we have at the moment and with the powers that we should be demanding for the future through independence.
Thank you, Simon. Collette, one last point on this. It struck me that in the reporting we're seeing suggestions that Johnson has gone cold air on onshore wind because of pushback from the Tory shires. Now, you're the MSP from East Kilbride. I remember the wind farm at Whiteley being built, and it's one of the most impressive and one of the biggest in the UK, I think, or it was certainly when it was built. Do your constituents object to the wind farm at Whiteley as being an issue, or are they more relaxed and more comfortable and understanding about the need and the benefits of onshore wind?
I think the residents in East Kilbride, and I can only speak on behalf of them, Andrew, is that they very much welcome that. And you speak to many folk, they would rather have that than any kind of nuclear power station. Yeah, I think Grant Chaps was on this morning, and he, speaking from Hertfordshire, and he was asked, would he be comfortable having a nuclear power station in his constituency? And he was rather vague in terms of the response that he gave back. And if you asked any of the residents here in East Kilbride, I'm sure they wouldn't be comfortable either, given the evidence and like what Simon mentioned about the dangers associated with nuclear power plants as well. It's not the way to go. And as you mentioned, Andrew, it's 1950s style, and feeding into a lot of their capitalist friends as well. When at the heart of it, it's about disinvestment more to green energy. So the wind farm is very much welcome. I've had major through that as well, which has helped locally. So I much hope to see more onshore energy going forward, and I do believe that is the future.
Collette, thank you. We'll move to our final story this afternoon, which is also a Scottish story, and that is that the Scottish rail company ScotRail has formally returned to public ownership for the first time in 25 years. The train operator is now under the control of the Scottish Government, of a Scottish Government-owned company called ScotRail Trains Limited, with the ScotRail name being retained and all the staff transferring from Barrow. Ekklesia had been running the ScotRail franchise for 7 years since 2015, but in 2019 the Scottish Government decided to end the franchise early following criticism for cancellations and performance levels. The First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has hailed the move to bring ScotRail back into public ownership as historic and momentous, and she said this new beginning creates a real opportunity to deliver a railway which is for the nation and fully focused on being run for the benefit of its users, customers, staff and stakeholders, as opposed to shareholders. She also stressed the key role that rail would play in meeting climate change targets and cutting emissions. Now, my colleague Hugh Stewart went to speak to Jenny Gilruth MSP, who's the SNP MSP for Mid-Fife and also the Transport Secretary, and he spoke to her on Friday afternoon, and we've got a short video clip of what she had to say.
What about plans to increase the train network, which of course is a reserved matter? What progress can you anticipate on devolving the rest of the train system, track and stations?
Of course, we want to see a full devolution of all railway powers, and at this moment in time that's not the case, but we would like to see all of the powers that are associated with the railway in Scotland's hands. In terms of the progress on that, you will be well cited on our relationship with the UK Government and their views on this, and indeed we made a contribution to the white paper consultation. Unfortunately, the views of the Scottish Government were not taken on board, so unfortunately no progress on that thus far. However, you'll also be aware of our manifesto commitment to hold an independence referendum next year, so we'll be pushing ahead with those plans and the full devolution of railway powers to the Parliament when, of course, we become independent again.
There we are, and that's my colleague Hugh Stewart talking to Jenny Gilruth MSP, the Transport Secretary, on Friday as ScotRail was taken back into Scottish Government ownership and was nationalised in all of our names. So Simon, we don't have a great deal of time left this afternoon. However, there's been a great deal of ferries in the news this week and trains as well, and so Do you think that public transport is being given the priority in financial or in policy terms that it requires, or speaking personally, what do you think should be improved next in public transport in Scotland?
Well, I mean, alongside retail, energy generation and distribution, transport is one of the main engines of the Scottish foundational economy. So it's absolutely vital. And I think a public ownership stake like this is absolutely crucial and should be extended further. We need a joined up public transport system. If we're going to get people out of cars and onto public transport, it can only be done by expanding the public transport network. We're heading into rows, of course, about investment. Labour and some of the trade unions will immediately start complaining there isn't enough investment in it. They'll be right about that, but in order to be able to invest, we need economic powers, we need transport powers, etc. So I hope that the new publicly owned ScotRail can develop a positive relationship with the unions in seeking pathways forward for that, both what we can do at the moment and what we need to be able to do in the future. But it's a great step forward. I've already mentioned the need for a public energy company. There are other public Scottish Government can take in order to be able to direct the economy in the right direction. But then there are those further powers that, as Jenny Gilruth pointed out, are needed to take that to its full conclusion. But I would finally say that the national economic strategy that the Scottish Government announced, their 10-year strategy, is incredibly weak on these issues, and we need a lot more work on it. And I'm sure SNP trade unionists and others would be very happy to talk to Kate Forbes about some possible way forward, which are bolder than the steps that are being proposed at the moment.
I certainly hope that they will, Simon, and I'm sure they'll get a reception from Kate Forbes. Collette, finally, Hugh was asking Jenny Gilruth there about how further progress can be made in certain circumstances where the rail infrastructure, rather than the train operating companies, but rail infrastructure is still reserved to Westminster. Do you think, is there a prospect of anything radical being done in those circumstances, or is the way to fix this independence for Scotland?
I think the answer to that, Andrew, is independence. And I can use that as a local example of where we have got a rail enhancement programme in East Kilbride here, where there's decarbonisation of the rail line from East Kilbride, and there's further work underway. However, what I always find it remarkable is the fact that the railway station itself is a reserve matter. So our hands, we're always constantly having to do something where one hand tied behind our back. And whilst I very much welcome the enhancements that are getting carried out here in East Kilbride, we could be more bolder, we could do things a lot better. So at the heart of that is gaining independence to ensure we have all the levers there to have a really good, bold, infrastructure transport strategy programme that meets the needs of our towns, cities and the people at the heart of that. And I know that, we have worked, and I know, having spoken to Kate Forbes and Jenny Gilruth as well, that, we have worked closely with the trade unions in terms of fair work practices. And I think that's been demonstrated throughout, as we continue to see all the staff from Abellio kept on, and no changes there. But at the heart of it is that from a local MSP perspective here, is seeing that enhancement and the timelines carried out to meet the needs of decarbonisation and net zero as well. So I very much welcome that news.
Thank you, Collette. And that was our final item this afternoon. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the financial support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support the work of Broadcasting Scotland, and we really need that financial support, then please consider donating or subscribing to Broadcasting Scotland, and you will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work, and if you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please go to www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meanwhile, I'd like to say many thanks to Collette Stevenson, MSP, and to Simon Barrow, who've been kind enough to join us this afternoon on the Full Scottish and to share with us their thoughts and reflections on the news and headlines from around Scotland and the world this past week. Collette, Simon, thank you both very much indeed.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope that you've enjoyed a tasty Full Scottish today. We will be here again tomorrow evening at 7 with Scotland at 7, so please join us then. But in the meantime, please keep warm and keep well. Bye-bye.